Okay, so we might as well get started. Welcome to this Academy of Ideas book club to discuss Kazuo Ishiguro's new novel, Klara and the Sun. My name's Jeff Kidder. I'm Membership and Events Director at the Academy of Ideas. Good to see you all this evening. People who've been to many book clubs and people who come for the first time, we're delighted that you're here. Just to say, probably most people here are over familiar with Zoom, but just in case you're not, the way this discussion works is Ella, who I'll introduce in a moment, will give an introduction on the book. Then we'll just open it up to points people want to make, questions, contributions on any aspect of the book or surrounding themes which you think are pertinent. If you'd like to speak at any point during the discussion, it's best to raise your hand metaphorically on Zoom. So either, depending on your device or computer, go to the bottom to the participant section or the reaction section. It's different on different types of computer. And there you have an option to raise your hand, which raises a blue hand, which I can then see and take people in turn to speak. If that doesn't work, you could either send me a note in the chat or wave your hand furiously or whatever, and we'll make sure that everybody gets to speak. The other announcement I should make is that at the Academy of Ideas, we've been saying this for a year now, and nobody's been furloughed during the pandemic. So if you are in a position at all to support us, either financially or through becoming an associate, please do so, and I'll put a link in the chat in a couple of minutes so that people can do that if they're in a position to. So just to say that Kazuo Ishiguro is a novelist we like at the Academy of Ideas Book Club. Many years ago, or it feels many years ago, we discussed Never Let Me Go, and back in 2015, Ella introduced what I think is my favorite of his novels, The Buried Giant, which is, some people here will have read. There's no obligation to have read it to come along, but it's quite an interesting book if you haven't read it. And we've invited Ella back again to discuss Klara and the Sun, which is a fascinating book about AI and a fascinating book about humanity. Ella, as some of you will know, is co-convenor of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is a festival of ideas and debate, which happens in London and will be back again, fingers crossed, in October, and is a journalist, writer, and author, a very interesting person to read generally. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Ella, who will give her introduction, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Ella.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for having me back again at the book club. You know, Klara and the Sun, it has this great line, rooms within rooms within rooms. And this is the human heart to Ishiguro, a strange house with rooms inside rooms. And this novel, rumoured to be his last, Klara and the Sun, in it he asks whether we believe in the cavernous capabilities of the heart, and actually more importantly, whether we might have forgotten what it is that really makes the heart human and the soul human. And through the eyes of this AF artificial friend called Klara, Ishiguro explores life between two families in a futuristic world of pollution, isolation, and bubbling and unexplained social unrest. Hired to be a companion to Josie, a preteen with an unexplained illness, Klara's task is to stave off the danger of loneliness creeping in. And it's actually quite remarkable reading loneliness described in this way, given the current context that we're in of the pandemic, because loneliness is an affliction that Ishiguro just basically turns into a virus, something which almost every single one of the characters in this novel is taking some precaution to prevent. And as with all Ishiguro novels, Klara and the Sun is layered with different meaning. It's dedicated to his mother, who died 2 years before its publication. I think that's very influential in the way in which the book is framed. The novel explores our most intimate relationships, unearthing why some of the things that make us human, like experiencing loss, love, and yearning, remain untouched, even in the bleak setting of a futuristic society in decay. And this is where there are lots of spoilers in my introduction, but I'm going to assume that lots of you have read the novel or either don't mind about spoilers. But the big spoiler is the question of this question that he asks, which is how much control should human beings have over nature, especially when it comes to shaping future generations. And he did an interview with The Guardian recently about the book in which he explained the nod to, spoiler alert, gene editing in the book as a means to explore his fears of the future. And he says in this Guardian interview, the nature of capitalism itself is changing its model. I do worry that we are not in control anymore of these things, which it sounds quite, that I had to fight that coloring my reading of the book, that comment that he made. But with Like Never Let Me Go and The Buried Giant, Ishiguro is asking, I think, the same questions about human beings' ability to shape the world around them and what dilemmas that process of shaping the world might raise. In 2015, he described his dirty secret, which was that he tends to write the same book over and over. And lots of people have suggested, I think actually even he has suggested, that Never Let Me Go, The Buried Giant, and now Klara and the Sun as takes on some form of a trilogy. But if we just look briefly at the kind of the political implications of the novel, because I have to admit I'm less enamored with Ishiguro's politics than I am with the way in which he writes. In particular, there was this interview in 2017 that he did just after he won the Nobel Prize, in which he talked about populism and the dangers of not fighting back against the kind of populist trend in Europe and repeating the 20th century in ways that really made me wince. But indeed, while Never Let Me Go looked at the way in which human beings understand the value of life, and The Buried Giant was about our desire to make meaning in the world, Klara and the Sun, I think, is Ishiguro's most forensic and pared back investigation into what truly makes us human. And actually, despite his concerns expressed in that Guardian interview about a changing world, I really don't think that the novel should be mistaken as some kind of either reaction against technological advances or some kind of dystopia, because in fact, the existence of artificial intelligence in the novel actually it almost melts into the background. I mean, Klara and her friend Rosa are the only AFs we really meet. And instead of focusing on the moral conundrum of human-like inventions, Ishiguro is really, I think, more interested in utilizing the objective, quite cold, quite formulaic, minimalist lens of Klara to the robot to examine the complex nature of human relationships. And much like the whispers of memory teasing readers throughout The Buried Giant, Ishiguro drip feeds us snippets of information throughout the book, and we find out that, you know, this secret or kind of unexplained idea of kids being lifted, and the kind of the nod to what that might mean in relation to gene editing, making them smarter. But it obviously then we find out also comes with a risk, because Sal, Josie's sister, had died from going through the process, and Josie's illness is a result of her mother Chrissy's choice to risk it again. And it's a thing, you know, in relation to this process of lifting is where the strongest political insights come in, where there's this amazing scene where we see the interaction meeting, as it's called, that Josie has to host with other children who have been lifted. And when things become fractious, as they do with kids and young people, between Rick, who is the only normal child who hasn't been lifted, and a particularly snotty member of the lifted crowd, got this, you know, really tense situation in which one of the mothers rushes in and tries to diffuse the situation, starts shouting at Rick. And Chrissy, Josie's mum, comes in and reminds her of the fact that this is all relatively artificial, that actually this meeting is about trying to artificially, in a very controlled and planned way, get these lifted kids to try and understand what it really means to have human interactions, to practice what it's like to be normal. She says, you know, if it's the only way that they'll learn, which is, you know, I think Ishiguro really making a point there about the stilted, you know, the stilted way in which we're moving towards interacting with each other, than ways in which not just artificial intelligence, but the changing nature of our human relationships creates problems for a natural kind of interaction with each other. And Ishiguro's answer to the question about human nature and understanding the heart is, I think, really that he says it's only through these interactions and relationships with other people that we reveal what it means to be human and the complexity of our rooms within rooms, even or especially when these social connections cause us pain. There's a moment of quiet insight when Klara and Chrissy, Josie's mum, are kind of skirting around the difference between human beings and artificial intelligence at that kind of early period when you really feel that, Chrissy's distrust and almost hatred of Klara, when she says it must be great not to miss things, not to long to get back to something, not to be looking back all the time. Chrissy says that to Klara as a way of defining what the difference is between her, the human, and the artificial friend. And I think it's really notable, and perhaps we can get into this in the discussion, that Klara is one of the few Ishiguro narrators who has no memory and does not look back, is incapable of looking back. You know, unlike Stevens, unlike Kathy and Never Let Me Go, and actually in a way, unlike Beatrix and Axel in The Buried Giant, who are constantly in the process of trying to look back and trying to remember what their past was. You know, what I think we could ask, what is Ishiguro trying to say there about the way in which we make meaning in relation to history, our own history and our collective history? I think that actually the main point I want to kind of make tonight is that I think Chrissy is the most important character in the novel, the mother, because she understands best what it is like to, and what it means to risk losing a piece of one's heart, a piece of that social connection, through Klara's eyes. When we first encounter her as aloof and uncaring and impersonal, we have a sense of her as being, you know, detached from her humanness, detached from her soul, not wanting to sit and have chats with her daughter, these kind of very staged, very tense breakfast meetings with the coffee morning that sort of Josie is really orchestrating rather than her mother. And at times it feels like the artificial friend Klara has more of an emotional attachment to her daughter than she does. But as the novel continues and we discover this horrendous, tragic secret of Chrissy's plans to get Klara to continue or clone Josie if it happens that Josie dies from this process of lifting, it becomes starkly clear how deep and inconsolable Chrissy's love is for her child, because she just cannot force herself to think like Mr. Capaldi, this really horrible, creepy guy who is working on Josie's robot clone, and who Klara plans to inhabit. He reprimands Chrissy for not accepting that there is no difference between her child and a robot pretending to be her child. She says, you're refusing to let go, and you're refusing to stop believing that there's something unreachable inside each of us. And Chrissy, even though she ums and ahs, really ultimately can't let go of that distinction. And at the end of the novel, when Capaldi returns to request that Klara be used as some kind of experiment, in this phrase he uses, reverse engineering, Chrissy steps in and protects the robot like a mother, insisting that she deserves her slow fade. And in this charge of emotion between mother and artificial robot, something very human happens. In fact, Klara describes the feeling of the brush of Chrissy's shoulder and her jumper when defending her against, you know, and remembers a previous time in which they embraced, when they go up into the mountains for that walk by the waterfall. In Ishiguro's world, our emotional connections are so important and so strong and so full of meaning that they can transcend the limitation between the black box of the artificial intelligence, that's what Capaldi describes Klara as, and the human heart. And this is not because I think, as Capaldi believes, there is no difference between us and them. I don't think that's what Ishiguro is saying. But it's actually because the complexity and wonder of human beings is so strong that we are able to give value and meaning to things which have no real understanding of meaning at all. And just to kind of finish, I think the main question Ishiguro is asking us is if we are willing to play God with human beings through gene editing or artificial intelligence or all these new things. He's fascinated by new technology, he says that in all his interviews, and the potential of what it might, you know, mean for changes in society. He's really asking, can an artificial friend like Klara become just as authentically human as us? And I think he answers that question quite definitively through Klara. In a final scenes when she's reunited with the manager of her store that she was initially bought from, while she's in this very bleak ending, actually waiting to fade in what's kind of loosely described as some kind of scrapyard, Klara says that the special something that Capaldi failed to recognize in Josie was not actually in Josie at all. It was inside those who loved her. And she's very aware of her limitations. She admits that she can never be the same as Josie. She says, I believe now there would have remained something beyond my reach. And, you know, I think it's remarkable that Ishiguro uses the word I believe, and important that he puts the word I believe into the mouth of a robot to give something that supposedly isn't able to share human consciousness, that doesn't have a heart or soul, the capability of putting faith in something through belief. And while many might have closed Klara in the Sun mourning Klara, and I certainly close the book in tears, because it really is quite a sad ending. And in Never, I remember reading his description of Never Let Me Go when he said it's a sad book, but it's not a dystopia. And I think there's something similar going on here. It doesn't have to be dystopian, but it is really, really pulls on your heartstrings. This is no dystopia. While her nourishment, Klara's nourishment, comes from the sky and the sun, it is in her ability to bring together the characters of this novel in that amazing scene that saves the day in Josie's bedroom when they are entranced by the orange half disc that looked as if it might catch a light. In this bleak world of terrifying technological advances and Cooper's machines that spit out gross, soot and dirt, and fathers who are absent, and all kinds of social problems and fear and risk and alienation, the sun still shines. And I think that's rather important. So I'll leave it there and open up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Ella. That was really, really interesting and many points raised. So I'm just going to hand it over. Really, if people have got any questions they'd like to ask, anything they'd like to raise themselves, other points that have not been covered by Ella in the introduction, just raise your hands. I'll give people a couple of minutes, and then we'll get going. Okay. And also, I'll ask people to, because most people are muted, so people can just unmute themselves and then speak. That's the best thing. Chrissy.
Hi. Yeah, I thought that was a very excellent introduction. I just wanted to sort of draw attention to what I thought was the crucial scene within the book, which is where the father and Klara are in the car together, and the father is explaining to Klara that he hates Capaldi, the man who's building the robot replacement, but that he confesses that he actually believes the same thing as Capaldi, that there is no intangible essence that makes a human different from the robot, but that he believes that the mother is only pretending to believe the same thing, and that once she is confronted with her replacement child, she will react very badly to that. So I felt that what he was doing there is he's holding withholding his own judgment as the writer. He is suggesting either that there is an essence, something which you can't put your finger on, which is beyond the possibility of AI, or that it is essential that we hold on to such a belief in order to make us human. So it's a very intriguing question, which I think probably is unanswerable ultimately, because of course at one step, and in one sense, we might be looking here at a particular stage in the advance of artificial intelligence, which is clearly not yet something that you could compare to a complete human being, but it may be moving towards such a thing, and that unanswerable question will remain probably indefinitely.
Thanks, Chrissy. Okay, Jane.
So I was just thinking, so obviously that all of the things in your introduction was very brilliant, and that humans making humanity, I think, which is the theme you're saying. But I just wondered what you thought about the whole faith part, almost the religious side of that, because obviously that the big thing in the novel is her getting the sun to come and shine on Josie, and whether so Ishiguro does seem to be bringing that in as well, sort of faith and something outside the human, but which isn't the scientific, and just wondered what you thought about that.
Thanks. Helen.
Hi. I really loved this book, and I really enjoyed your introduction, Ella. I thought what was brilliant about this book was that he uses, it's really what you're saying in terms of exploring the heart, but that he uses the device of the AF to absolutely dissect and understand both empathy and human emotions in general. I thought the most moving part of one of the best bits of the book, I thought, was the bit when she's in the window and she sees the old man and the woman come together, and that she sees that they're both, you know, that they come together and there's happiness and sadness at the same time in terms of their that sort of meeting of them together. And then Klara then makes sense of that. She's so empathetic in a way that she can, in her very simple, naive way, kind of make sense of essentially what is pathos, I suppose, you know, the sort of sadness that can exist within and joy and the sort of evoking of pity for people. And I think that, but because it's broken down, it's not like she immediately understands what's happening, but she then kind of imagines a scenario that they haven't seen each other for a long time and they do all this. And I think that he does this again and again through the book, in that she sort of pieces together what the human counterparts are thinking in a way that makes us as the reader think about those emotions, those sort of very human emotions, in a very kind of profound and fresh way. It's not just a book that makes you weep at the end, but it's a book that actually forces you to make sense of all of those emotions. And so I thought that was, and so like I think I said when we discussed another book, which was Artificial Intelligence, I think all of these books about artificial intelligence are really just about humanity. It's just a way, a device to kind of understand humanity. The second thing I thought was very interesting is, and I think this is him as a great writer, is that he has this wonderful way of not explaining things, and then just gradually over the course of the book, they make sense. So he treats the reader like a grown-up, which is so refreshing. So the bit about, you know, you begin to understand that when she gets a bit discombobulated, then, you know, her vision gets into these sort of boxes or squares or whatever she says. And when things are really a bit fraught and she doesn't know what's going on, then they become even more, and you sort of, at first when she mentions the boxes, you're like, what is this? But you're forced to think, and you're forced to kind of rethink about how we see things. So at one point it says, you know, that the face filled all the boxes, and that just the way he's making us think about how we look at things and how we experience things, I think is really brilliant. And so he kind of introduces all sorts of things like lifting, what happens to the father? He's substituted, which you realize means he's lost his job. You know, there are these sort of things he has where he doesn't you know, then give you a little footnote and say, well, that means da, 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 da. He's just expecting the reader to be grown up and make sense of it and to come along with him on the journey. And I thought that was also really good. My final thing, just to start with, it also did remind me, for those of us who read this to our children, it reminded me of the Velveteen Rabbit. I cried in that as well. So, you know, it does have that sort of ending that, you know, being put out to pasture and forgotten. And I feel he owes a lot to that book as well.
Thanks, Ellen. Patricia. Yeah, you need to unmute. Yeah, you need to unmute, Patricia.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can now, yes.
Oh, right. When Clara's at the end of the book and she's doing her slow fade and she's talking to the manager and she says that she couldn't have become Josie or continued Josie because of the people around Josie, the people who loved her mother, the housekeeper, the boy next door. Is Ishiguro trying to say that we are what we are because of the people who love us and their attitude towards us? What do other people think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question to explore. I'll take a couple of people with their hands up, then I'll ask Ella to make some reflections, and then we'll come back out again. Lara.
Yeah, I thought that my favorite character in the book is Rick, actually, because he's unlifted. He will never go to college. but it's very humane in a kind of, you know, in a simple way. He helps Klara, he takes her to the barn, and without asking many questions, and he just sits and wait for her to finish what she's doing. And I think that maybe Ishiguro wants to tell us something about this kind of humanity that maybe is, I don't know, not modern, or is just traditional. I don't know if people have any thoughts about that.
Thank you. Brief.
I thought it was interesting that we see, I think, probably about a period of 5 years when Klara, from when Klara is introduced to the family until Josie goes to college. And that's, Klara seems to go through a whole life cycle during that time. You know, she's an infant, she's a child, while she's in the shop, learning and observing human behavior. And thinking in particular, I think about human loneliness. And then she comes and she stays with Josie, and she kind of grows up a little bit as she learns and is exposed a lot more. And I think she also then takes on a mothering type role when she has to essentially look after Josie while she's so ill, and supervise her. And then the sad bit at the end where she's pretty much at the end of her life, for the slow fade, and she reflects back on her life. And so I know Ella said she doesn't seem to have a memory, but I think that's, she's processing whatever is in her black box while she's in this scrapyard, essentially, but feels very happy about the life that she's lived, and explains that to the manager, who finds her and is pleased that she did a good job, essentially, in relation to the family as well as she could. And I thought that was quite nice. Obviously, it's very sad, I thought, that the family kind of like dumped her. They obviously understood that there was going to be this slow phase. So we're looking at it from a human point of view. She's artificially intelligent, and presumably somewhere along the way she knew that, or she understood that she had a life, a short time in which to work with this family. And then once that job was done, that job was done. Whereas for the family, when Josie went to college, she gave Klara a hug and said thank you, more or less, and then turned her back on her, as did the manager, who didn't look back. You know, after that had the conversation, she didn't look back where we thought she was going to look back and wave or whatever. You know, I suppose I was anyway, beginning to think, God, this artificial friend has acquired human traits, but Ishiguro basically keeps putting us back to the fact that she's an artificially intelligent, and that's it. But I just want to raise a question about Mr. Capelli. It's a bit pathetic, really, but did anybody else think, when the housekeeper was warning Klara when she was going to this visit with Klara to see Mr. Capelli, and she was saying, keep an eye on her, don't leave her alone with him, thinking, pedophile, pedophile. I think this is too much of kind of 21st century obsessions impeding or affecting or helping us judge what was going on there. On the question that was asked about love, I mean, I think it was quite nice the way that, at least I understood it, that Mr. Capaldi, for example, was looking for what makes people human in the black box, how they work things out, why they were so intelligent, etc., etc. And he wanted to look for what made artificial intelligence so bright and so advanced? And the answer was that we live in human society, and it's how we interact with people and how people love each other. And in this instance, how the family loved Josie so much, that was would never be reachable to someone who is technically looking for an understanding of how people work.
Thanks, Breach. Okay, back to Ella for your reflections, and we go.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the point that Chrissy began with in terms of Ishiguro withholding his judgment, and that Breach has pointed to just there about never really quite admitting whether he thinks that the AF is capable of the same, or actually maybe even more advanced emotional interaction with the characters than the characters themselves. That continual, denial of you of a kind of a clear answer from that, even though as I said in the introduction, I think he gives a definitive, I think kind of almost politically, he gives a definitive point that he doesn't want to suggest. I think he doesn't want to give in to the idea that maybe not politically, maybe philosophically, that human beings could be explained and replicated through artificial intelligence. But Klara is an aberration. Klara is unique, unusual. We're told that a lot by the manager is trying to sell her at the start. Okay, so there's a certain amount of cynicism there, but she is curious, even though these AFs are built to learn and to pick up things and to move from a state of kind of childlike education to understanding they're human beings enough to provoke happiness and stave off loneliness. Unlike Rosa, who just kind of is a bit like a bored teenager filing her nails in the window, unlike Rosa, Klara gets angry at Rosa for not, she keeps saying, look at the person over there, as Helen said, look at that interaction. Didn't that interest you? Let's have a conversation with it. And Rosa just forgets, and she doesn't pay attention to anything. Her attention span is really short. And I mean, one of the best parts in which Ishiguro nods to the fact that Klara is curious in a way that really only we would understand human beings to be, is the part in which she deceives everyone. Not deceives, but she secretly goes in to look at the Josie clone. She's, rather than just being this obedient robot that's like a servant. And actually, as a side point, I think it's interesting that Ishiguro quite often returns to people who are, downstairs, for want of a better word, whether it be Stevens or Klara as this kind of servant robot, to get that kind of inside perspective and see people in ways in which they wouldn't want to be seen, and see the different sides to people. But she sneaks off and looks at the Josie robot, which is, and Helen's right, Ishiguro doesn't go too much into that. She just does go off and sneak off. But that's telling you that she's, she thinks that it's worthwhile for her to learn about this, but she is actually really wants to know what's in, she's eavesdrops on them. She wants to know what's going on, and she goes off and does something which she knows is going to possibly cause her trouble, because otherwise why would she sneak about doing it? So that's that's very advanced. That's suggesting it's a kind of intelligence, a kind of emotional intelligence and curiosity and independence, actually, importantly, that you wouldn't attribute, you'd be very nervous to attribute to artificial intelligence. I mean, just as a side note, in one of the interviews, I think it was one of the recent ones, or it perhaps was after the Nobel Prize, Ishiguro said that he did believe that there could be AI written novels, and that he said that he was okay with that actually he was quite excited to see with what they'd come up with. And then he went on a long thing about how we need kind of diversity in literature, which is where I start to nod off. But he made some interesting points about artificial intelligence. He does, even though he'd said to the Guardian that he fears where capitalism is going, he's also, on the other hand, quite actually, I think, blasé about the way in which artificial intelligence and technology might affect very human things like the creation of art or the expression of human emotion in literature. Just picking up on a few other things quickly, Jeff. The thing about the sun and faith and belief that Jane mentioned, is interesting because the son does feel Klara. So that is true. So there is nothing, it's fact-based in terms of she is powered by the sun. And so her desire to transplant that nourishment onto Josie is in one way more about just her naivety of not understanding what it is fuels human beings. She's but also is, you know, quite a strong point in terms of she herself sees no or little difference between her and Josie, even though she, you know, she understands that she's an AF, she understands what her purpose is, but in that belief in the sun that moves away from fact, she is making a greater connection between herself and Josie that I think Josie or Chrissy would make between her and them. And, you know, just on a point of, perhaps this is a superficial point, but I don't know what other people felt, I think it was, for me anyway, I think it was deliberate that you don't really, I didn't massively empathize or sympathize with Josie. In fact, I didn't particularly like her a lot of the time. I thought she was a little brat. And even though I felt sort of pity for her because of the way in which her family, you know, you might see she kind of got a screwed up family situation and the relationship with the mother and the father, and it's all, you know, as Bree says, kind of modern preoccupations. But I just didn't have that connection, which I agree with Laura, I did have with Rick, where you just think Rick is this wonderful boy who is perceptive in ways which none of the adults are. And there's that kind of, you know, that really awful moment where he basically schools Chrissy when they think Josie is in her last hours, where he just think, oh, this kid. But there is a lot of the human characters are deeply flawed, are actually quite unlikable. And Briege is right, you know, the whole Capaldi scene, I just thought, oh, where is this going? Why is everyone talking about the creepiness of Capaldi? And even actually, I started thinking that the dad was a weirdo because the way in which he was described. So there are all these kind of deeply flawed human beings. And then there's this objective kind of, you know, attempting to be unemotional, you know, framework of Klara, which actually all the emotion just pours into. And she's the one that really captures all of that, where the others are lacking. And I guess the question for us to maybe discuss is that saying that the things that make us human, these complex feelings, are actually more simple than we thought and can be replicated and pick up? Or is it what I guess what I was suggesting in my introduction, that they are so, the ability for human beings to create meaning and desire to express emotion is so powerful that it can be even loaded into an inanimate object, in terms of an animate object, you know, a robot, cold metal, and machinery. Let's go back and discuss it.
Thanks, Ella. Yeah, let's carry on. Anne.
Thanks. I was totally blown away with this, and I've read only a limited amount of Ishiguro before. I have to confess I've never read Never Let Me Go, despite being really interested in all of the issues, because I just thought that I would find it too emotional to read, actually. And with this, I think it really claws at you. I just really wonder, though, the way that we're talking about his presentation of artificial intelligence through this, and the relationship between artificial intelligence and humanity, because I absolutely, I totally agree that this is about humanity, and it's about what makes us unique in who we are. But there's something about Klara that is just not artificial intelligence. And I don't think it's that he's overstepped in writing it and tried not deliberately to put something into Klara that it would be impossible to do with artificial intelligence. I think it's right there from the point that he refers all the time. She's referred to as an artificial friend rather than a robot. That I am, you know, we are talking here about an artificial friend. And the reason why I make that point is because there's something, isn't there, about Klara, which is what enables her to do her job is, or to do the function of this thing, is not intelligence at all. It's not an ability to think in a structured way or work out solutions. It's those things of empathy and understanding, and as you were saying, Ellen, belief in the fact that something can happen, which are all things, the empathy and belief and understanding, which are kind of, I think, and I know very, very little about the AI debate and so on, but which would seem to be completely outside of what AI could do. So AI could provide loads of support and all of that. It can come to all kinds of solutions about things, but the idea of empathy is, and understanding is a bit out with it. And so I just sort of wonder if there's something that he's raising which is a little bit different to the way in which we're normally talking about AI and humanity. It almost seems to me as though this is not really AI, it's more a kind of fantasy which makes us look at the world in a different way. And I was drawn very much to what the point that Helen made when she was saying about how he is a writer. Helen made the point that he treats us like adults. He doesn't kind of explain everything. He throws things out. But what it, and I agree with that, but what it sort of suggested to me was how he's really talking about context. And there's so much in this book that almost appears very dark and menacing, even before you get to any of the dark stuff. There's just this mood about it. And I think the mood is that we don't really understand. We know we don't understand what's going on around, and it just kind of hovers, that sense that there's something unsaid, which I guess is where everybody is, certainly where Klara is, of not understanding some of what's really going on. Anyway, that's completely incoherent. And a bit distracted by a dog with squeaky toy. But anyway, thanks.
Thanks, very interesting, Anne. Thanks. Joel.
Hi, I really liked your introduction, Ella. And Anne, actually, it didn't seem incoherent because I thought there was a lot in that about the mood. And I think we're used to that from science fiction, aren't we, around AI? And we've seen a lot, I'm assuming, most people have seen a lot of science fiction that really sort of grapples with AI and that whole idea about what it is to be human and the AI that can become sort of more than just a sort of, as somebody talked about, processing. I really enjoyed this book, and I loved the way that it gradually sort of revealed but never fully explained everything. So you had to really, I think somebody else mentioned this as well, you really had to kind of imagine. So quite often, when Klara was talking, or about the boxes and seeing the boxes, it often felt like that appeared in moments where she couldn't fully understand what was going on, and moments of stress and tension, which were, I thought, quite interesting. It was almost like a slight mechanical breakdown in a way, and sort of revealed that sort of machine nature and division. And one of the questions that I'm really fascinated by AI, and I've read not masses, but a fair bit. And, I think AI is very, or assumed to be very goal orientated, and is one of the sort of big fears around AI. And one of the things that Klara exhibits, I think a few people mention, is she seems to have some empathy and understanding. And not only that, but a kind of judgment. I think, Ella, you were talking about, when she goes to see the robot body that's going to replace Josie. And I thought, that there wasn't a sort of, having a sort of a deception about and making a judgment about what to do. But also I thought there's that bigger question about what is intelligence, and some of the stuff, you know, that I've read around that and around consciousness and AI, you know, I don't think people really agree exactly what intelligence is. You know, there's still one of these sort of hotly contested things. And I was recently reading some Merleau-Ponty, who was a French philosopher who sort of about the same time as Sartre and de Beauvoir. And he talks about this notion of, he wrote a whole book about perception and the idea that people sort of assume that too much of intelligence, and not too much of intelligence, but we tend to separate the mind and body. And he's really in this whole sort of notion about that our experience is so tied into embodiment, and you know, we can't necessarily separate those things. I think it goes back to that sort of Cartesian sort of split of mind and body. And I think that's one of the big challenges of AI and the whole idea of consciousness, and why it's become so sort of hard to, you know, kind of explain. And I think it does throw up all of these questions about how we as humans really learn and experience things in, it's not just a mental experience, it's something that I feel is quite embodied as well. And it's something that Klara seems to be able to sort of tap into, but never quite fully. It's funny, I also just didn't have the same emotional connection with Klara at the end. I didn't feel that tearfulness and sad. I perhaps, you know, I saw her as the robot whose time was up. And again, I think, as other people have said, I think Rick was the character that I sort of most sort of felt very loving towards.
Thanks, Joel. So I'll take Helen again. If anybody else wants to ask questions or you know, raise anything else we haven't mentioned at all, then feel free to put your hand up. Helen.
Yeah, I'm just listening to the discussion. I think the more I listen to what people are saying, the more I think that I don't think it's, I mean, I've said already, I don't think it's about AI, but I think that when you think about the ending, and you think about how people become human, obviously we become human through interacting with other humans, through observing, through empathy, but also the way that other people interact with us. And I think that what the ending is really all about is that you can't become, I think this is what it's about, you can't really become human in isolation. Because what happens to Klara is that she has the empathy, she can put herself in other people's shoes, she can, you know, over time begin to make sense of what is happening to people, but nobody empathizes with her. There's no kind of, it's not a two-way street. She is the ultimate lonely person. She's the person who can't have the real genuine two-way interaction with others. And so and when she says she couldn't become Josie because she wouldn't have you know, what other people had, I think that's what she's really saying, is that what makes us human, because I think she's a metaphor for what makes us human, is both sides of things. It's both having empathy and having people love you or empathize with you. And she doesn't have the second part of it. In fact, when she goes into the room with the sadly named Helen, who is who calls her a vacuum cleaner, you know, and she says, oh, well, should I call you a person or a vacuum cleaner, or, you know, whatever it is. And nobody can relate to her as a human. And so she never has that sort of sense of trust and what it means to be loved. And I think that that's and I think you can see also that when Klara, when Josie wakes up in the middle of the night afraid to die, you know, that bit where she calls for her mum and she realizes she would never, that Josie would never feel like that about her, in terms of the comfort and joy that, you know, your parent can bring you when you have deep parental love. And I think that's what really the book is saying, is it is about experience. It is, you know, we're not born with you know, all of our fully made emotions. We develop them through our interactions with people, and all of her interactions are so one-sided. The other thing I just wanted to say is I thought very much, I think Ella made this point, that he does like this theme of servants. But I thought what was different, because in Remains of the Day, you know, it's all about the servant's relationship to that terrible bloke whose name I can't now remember, who is the Nazi. And in that, the servile relationship is absolutely crushing, because he never can actually become himself, and he can't even recognize when someone loves him. But in this, he's developed the idea of that, so you know, being servile, in that Klara does fight back, you know, like when she's told to do things and she's not asked in a nice way, like when she's told to flip over and do all that, she resists it. And when she, you know, and she's defiant. And I think that is it's a development. And I think it kind of, you know, I think it's a very interesting, he does keep that servile theme, but he's obviously moved it on a bit in terms of how that relationship can develop. And I thought that was quite interesting as well.
Chrissy?
Hi. Yeah, I think agree absolutely with what Helen's just saying there. It leads into what I was thinking about, which is to do with how Klara is the only character, or only main character in the book, who isn't motivated by her own self-interest. She's motivated by her programming, basically, which is to care for the girl. And in a sense, I find that's interesting, in that it seems to be because she doesn't have her own center. She's not centered in terms of her own self-interest in the way the other characters are. That goes a long way to explaining why she can't be drawn into humanity and can't become humanized through social relations. So it's not that she, like so many other characters that have looked at robots and AI, seem to miss that. So it's not a question of will, it's not a question of emotion, it is a question of this relationship, how self-interest and becoming socialized and recognizing the self within the other and all of that's the essence of what it means to be human. In terms of this sort of plausibility of it, I think it comes a lot closer to being plausible than most of the other explorations of the possible relations with humans and robots, in the sense that she is not constructed to do the sort of things that machines are really good at. She is created to be a companion, a friend to a child. So because it's often occurred to me that if humanity were to create a type of artificial intelligence that is capable of human consciousness, that it would necessarily be bound up with the ability to make mistakes. We can't really be human without that capacity, and that's exactly what we don't want from machines when they are being useful and in an industrial context. So I found that actually relatively convincing as a possible prediction toward the future. I just wanted to finish on one final thing, which I think is intriguing. Is a few people have mentioned that they have more sympathy with Rick than most of the other characters, and I go along with that. But I would just like to mention that Rick's abiding passion is creating bird drones. So his hobby, which is also likely to be his future career, is all bound up with engineering these birds that look convincing as real birds, but are in fact robots. And it's quite clear that if he is going to have a future in this, it's going to be quite a sinister job that he will be involved in the sense that he's going to be creating surveillance drones, and that does sort of hint at quite a dystopian aspect to this future where we're all going to be watched without knowing when we're going to be watched. And he also he's asked about this at one point, and he basically gives the he gives the excuse of instrumental reason, that it's not up to him to decide on the ethics of this sort of work. That's really up to the government to decide that. So in some senses there, I think that his character has got something, another level to think about anyway.
Thanks. I'll get Ella to come back on some points, and then we'll see if we've got people want one more round. Some of that dystopian stuff hasn't really been mentioned that much. Obviously, somebody's just asked in the chat about what do we think about lifting and what it means and what it is. And also there was the father who was very pointedly accused of whether he was a fascist or he lived in a fascist commune, and also where was it situated, because they kept saying they'd been to England, and then they talked about going to California or wherever at some point, but it wasn't clear where the whole situation. It was like the continents had moved. So there's that whole side of things as well. Ella.
Yeah, Jane, I think it was Sanderman, made a point in the chat about how Never Let Me Go is this, just thinking about setting, is this incredibly barbaric situation of utilizing clones and harvesting organs in a normal seeming world for all intents and purposes, in that kind of English countryside and quite idyllic kind of pastoral scenes and that kind of thing. But I think a similar thing is happening. There's nothing necessarily barbaric, although I do think the use and abuse of Klara, which I think Bree mentioned maybe, the way in which the human beings just kind of dispose of her is it's not quite organ harvesting, but that kind of use and abuse of instrumental use of something that's acting, or even almost acting like human, is pretty distasteful. But in the same way in Klara and the Sun, I mean, I think it's loosely based on something kind of American, because they used phrases like sidewalks and they say mom, M-O-M, and like there's some hints that it's somehow related to America. But it's kind of that, like as Jeff says, there are so many things happening in the background, whether it's this hint of fascism, which is kind of made as a throwaway comment, almost in a bitchy sense, against the dad, and he reacts very badly about it. But there's the suggestion of some kind of as Jeff says, communes. There's the question of why we've got to a situation in which some kids are being lifted and some are not. I mean, to Chrissy's point about Rick, yes, but I think it's his decision to do that makes sense in the context of this world in which it's kind of dog eat dog, eat or be eaten. It feels like that there's a real desperation. I mean, one of the most frightening parts of that interaction meeting that the kids have is this kind of simmering competition and desperation that, the whole nature of the kids being lifted is about, they're living in a world of scarcity, that actually you have to take on board this huge risk of your child maybe dying. I mean, the fact that Chrissy does it twice after Sal has died means there's some kind of pressure in the background pushing the characters to make these decisions, and we're never really told we're not told what the context of that is. What is the pressure that's pushing Rick's mother to go and debase herself so awfully with this guy in order to give her kid a chance? There's even the you couldn't see the kind of when I initially read the bit about the Cootings machine and the pollution, I thought, oh god, here we go, please don't be making a kind of environmentalist point. But it wasn't that. It was that there's something wrong with this society, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The fact, and he also uses not even kind of futuristic things to point that out. I mean, the fact that the beggar man is supposed, is he dead? Is he not? And then he gets up or he moves. And there's that whole there's a kind of simmering nastiness in all of this, which only gives only shines a brighter light, like the sun, on the moments in which Klara is so wonderful. So there's, you know, that to go back to that interaction meeting, because I think that was really one of the most important scenes in the book. The fact that she dislikes Josie, really, actually, in that the way in which she sees Josie being this little bitch of a teenager, kind of, you know, doing down on Rick, supposedly her childhood sweetheart, the love of her life, and doing all those things that teenagers do, which is kind of demeaning people, not standing up for people, and the tensions that are going on there. You can feel Clara's, you know, dislike, and she has to actually reassure herself later, I think, when she's talking to Rick, where she says, I know, I think, I believe that that Josie is good, but she just has, but you know, that kind of, I think Joel was talking about intelligence. I mean, what is intelligence if not preempting what you think someone else is feeling or thinking, or actually even preempting what you think someone's personality is like and the kind of human being they are. Just two other points. You know, the whole, what Helen was talking about in terms of, I think Helen and Chrissy were talking about in terms of the fact that not just that people are flawed, but also that the question of making mistakes or experiencing loss is important to how we understand people being human. I mean, I suppose that's why I really honed in on Chrissy as one of the more complex characters, because she's not just like Josie or Helen, who's a bit kind of like, even though you get this hint that Helen's had this real backstory, quite interesting past, she's this kind of frivolous character, and the housekeeper is just the housekeeper, and the dad is just the dad. But Chrissy's got this kind of this pushing and pulling within her because of the fact that she's lost a child. And I think that the way in which even Josie is kind of has this almost artificial relationship with her mother, even though she does call for her mum in that time of need when it's in the dark parts of her illness. It's all a bit performative, because I think what Ishiguro is really saying is and I don't want to make too much of a political point here in terms of the things that we might be interested in, celebrating the fact that people do have to go through hardship, you know, this much maligned concept these days that anything that kind of breaks your spirit momentarily is to be avoided. But I think he is saying something about that, because it's the characters who are most interesting, who are most able to you're most able to empathize with, have either felt disappointment or loss. I mean, Rick has felt disappointment, and Chrissy. And there is this, you know, Helen pointed to the last few pages where Josie's talking to the manager. And I mean, she says the reason why she thinks she can never be like Josie is because I'd never have reached what they felt for Josie in their hearts, which is, yeah, they would never love me. I'm now sure of this, manager, she says. And then the manager says, well, Klara, I'm glad you feel things worked out for the best. And you just think, oh, my heart is broken for this robot who's just, I mean, I think that's the thing. That's the reason why I cried at the end, is because that is the fear of loneliness. I think that, you know, that the fact that he wrote this, you know, at a time when his mother had died and was dying, and his relationship to a parent dying and the loss of that, but also the world we live in, which is, you know, I think colored in many ways by fear of alienation and a fear of the inevitableness of alienation, that the real, you know, the real danger is not the fascism or the Putin's machine or all these kinds of things, but it's not being able to relate to each other and not being human, because no one's ever recognized your humanness. No one ever actually feels for you. And that's, you know, that Klara dies, in as much as a robot can die, lonely. You know, the manager scrapes, she makes an awful noise scraping the crate away, and as Bruce says, doesn't look back. It's like that's what in the dark nights of the soul that we have, that's, I think, what everyone is fearful of. And in that, I mean, that's the power of Ishiguro. That's, in fact, actually, if I just remember a point that I made in my review of The Buried Giant that I wrote for Spiked, he said the central concern of that novel was the fear of the past and whether its hidden secrets will change the future. You know, that fear of, I actually think I'm contradicting myself now. I said that Klara didn't have a memory, but actually the fear she does, and she does, the book is her reflecting. So in some ways she does have a memory, but it's that fear of looking back on your life and thinking, I didn't really ever have an impact on anyone. I was lonely. And that's what Klara kind of comes to the conclusion of, because that's why Josie could flip off to college and not really care about her, and why even the mother, though she does, does care about her in some way, really only utilized her for what she needed her to perform, either as a clone or as a friend for her daughter. And so that, it's not to use Ishiguro's word, it's not bleak, it's not dystopian, but it's sad. It's that kind of, that fear of loneliness that I think is so central to the book, but it's also central to, I don't think he just wants you to kind of cry as I did, but he wants you to realize that sadness, that fear, that desperation is unbreakable from what it means to be human, that actually you can't have the sun shining and the light and all of that without the, I'm sounding cliche now, but without the darkness, without the fear side of it. Yeah.
Okay, so well, one more round. So if people have got any final things they want to raise, anything that hasn't been discussed yet. Certainly Helen made the point earlier that, and I know, having read a number of Ishiguro books, it's often we say when we discuss these authors, when you hear the authors interviewed, you think, oh, they wrote a really good book which captured something. But when they try and explain it, you think, oh, that's rather disappointing. The novel did it really well. And Ishiguro is one of those people who, you don't always agree with what he said, as Ella said, but he actually has quite a good grasp of many things. And when he's interviewed, it's always very interesting, as well as his novels being very interesting. And Helen made that point that I don't know quite what you're saying, but you understand something when you finish reading his novel, you understand something of your own life that you didn't understand before. I don't know how he does it, but it's often you understand something about society from reading a novel, but reading Ishiguro, you understand quite profound things about your own life, which you didn't understand before. So I know when we discuss it at the book club and when we do The Buried Giants, the classic of this, people haven't read it, but and this novel as well, you even don't always know what it is and you have to work out what it is, but it just has that effect. Are there any other things people want to raise, or just now's your chance, and then I'll get Ella to summarize. Do feel free. Helen, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't want to oversay, but I thought on the thing about lifting, I thought that it was quite an interesting kind of next step of how, of some of the sort of thoughts around parenting at the moment. I thought it was quite a kind of cynical portrayal of what happens. I mean, like in Washington, there's, I don't know, 2 elite schools, and people do everything to get their kids into school because that's the path to Yale or Harvard or whatever it is. And that sort of notion that you've got this one chance, and if you're not going to take it for your child, you have to make this sacrifice in order for your child to have the best thing, rather than realizing that actually let them live and they'll actually become good human beings. I think he is sort of poking, not fun, he's criticizing that attitude that I think is very prevalent amongst sort of upper middle class, certainly American parents. I can't believe it doesn't happen in Britain as well, that that it's like, you've got this one shot, I have to give up everything, I have to almost live the life of my child in order to give them this sort of opportunity to become who they are. And I thought the other thing was that was interesting was that when you say that Josie isn't a very sympathetic character, I mean, I do think she's a teenager. And in fact, the fact that she's been lifted is neither one thing or the other. I mean, she's just a really horrible, bratty teen. I mean, I thought when she didn't say goodbye to Klara, I thought, again, my kids didn't really say goodbye to me very much when they went to university. They were just like, bye, mum, I'm off. So, and I'm sure if we all look back on how we looked at it, I think I looked up actually, does he have a child? Because he must know how mean and horrible children can be to their parents. And yes, he does. So I think he also kind of, he in a slightly fun way captures that sort of thing. Like when they say, oh, she's so, what does Rick call her? Changeable. That she's one thing to one people and one thing to another people. And that's very human as well. I think that's what Chrissy was saying, that those things are, they're important. And I think he observes those things really well and kind of makes fun of ourselves in doing that.
Thanks. Sarah.
Yeah, well, for me, the novel really raised huge questions about the sort of the codification of emotions and the codification of emotional intelligence. And I completely take, what Ella and Ishiguro talk about with rooms within rooms within rooms, and the sort of like the essential unknowableness of emotions, but at the same time there is a layer on top of that is codified and that is contextual, and that as a society and we make decisions about what emotional intelligence is. A lot of human resources work in workplaces is about imposing that and being very, very clear on what emotional intelligence is and isn't. And so you have like Klara, who has been coded with emotional intelligence, and we see a stark contrast between her intelligence in terms of human empathy, which has been coded, and her kind of like wild interpretations on how to cure Klara. And I was just sort of cringing that she was going to be discovered with these just like really odd ideas that she'd go to a barn and tell the son that Josie needed to be recovered. And that does point to the sort of like that ultimately artificial intelligence is about human intelligence, and Klara has only been partly coded, hasn't she? She's very limited in that respect, but it also says something about how we all are coded to a certain extent. We're all subjected to those forces and those pressures to behave in a certain way, or we won't be popular. And I know that when Gary Newman, the pop star, who's got Asperger's syndrome, when he met his wife kind of coded him. She taught him a load of rules and said, well, if another person is doing this means that they feel this, and therefore maybe you might want to do this. And so, in a way, to a certain extent, we are all coded.
Thanks, Sarah. Joel.
That's really interesting, Sarah, that thing about coded, because one of the things about AI at the moment is, of course, it's running behind so many things. And, one of the most common ways that we experience it is, if you like this, then you'll like this. And the way that the algorithms are sort of sold to us all the time through everything from Spotify to Facebook. I just wanted to come back to Wendy's comment, actually, which is, again, that the menacing thing is the idea of machines substituting or replacing humans, because I know, in some ways, for many people, it's the focus on the human relationships and what that means. And I think often a lot of the conversations around AI have been very much about that the last few years. And I wonder whether there's a sort of, I wonder if there's a sort of current sort of reaction against the more sort of extreme sort of scientism that we've had through technology over the last few years. That the sort of idea that we're all just a bunch of matter, and because I think there are some scientists who, particularly sort of at the beginning of sort of things of AI, there was a whole bunch of people who were sort of warning against AI, but there were a lot of people who really, there's this big debate about free will at the moment and whether determinism, and that's sort of going on between various sort of philosophers. And again, it sort of taps into consciousness and those things about whether we're actually all sort of on a sort of set path, and whether we've really chosen and have agency. And I think this book sort of plays with some of that in a way, in the way that, Klara again comes up with, she seems to have her own agency, in spite of being an AI. And also that thing that you mentioned about the son, because I also found myself cringing moments about that almost going to be discovered for having this sort of really stupid belief that the sun was, and I know, Ella, you said that there was a fact in it, you know, she was solar powered, and so that was how her own rationality and belief, and that kind of makes sense. But it's that, there's that sort of tension between the rationality and mechanical and machine view of the world, and that of the sort of human nature again. And I think in a way that's what sort of makes it work as a book, really.
Thanks very much, Jo. Are there any final points or questions? If not, I'll just, yeah. So now is the time to raise your hand. Any final points? And then I'll bring Ella, Para.
Hi, Ella. I really enjoyed the intro and lots of really good points made. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's my first introduction to this author, so very keen to read some of the other books. The only point I wanted to make is just about the sun business, because you could flip it around and see it as humans, when they're really into wanting something to happen, like, you know, make someone better. If people are ill, for instance, you would believe anything and go for anything, including irrational stuff that you know in your head might not work, but you'd go for it. So when you looked at Klara walked to the barn to try and talk to the sun, she also persuaded Josie's dad to take some of her liquid and sabotage this machine. And you think, surely he must have known that there are millions of machines out there all doing the same thing. But for me, it read like, you know, you'd grasp at hope if you want his daughter in this instance to be better. So I think it is very much, and someone said this, the metaphor for how humans are and the way we work with each other and relate to each other. And it's not always all rational and, you know, straightforward.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there. And then I'll ask Ella to sum up for as long as you like on as many, any outstanding points or anything you'd like to.
Yeah, that's, I mean, we covered so much. There's not, I agree with lots of the points. Helen has just pointed the fact that, as Para says, Klara gives up part of herself for Josie, which is very human. And I mean, not to keep banging on about Chrissy, but I think it is important that Ishiguro is in her own way. Chrissy is risking giving up something in order to prolong Josie. She's trying to give up her belief in humanity. She's trying to give up her own intelligence, sanity, whatever it is, to try and save her daughter in some kind of a way, in this very perverse way. And obviously, actually, it's her mother's love that prevents her from doing. I mean, we'll never know because Josie survives, but there's you know, that her kind of desire to sacrifice herself or some part of herself for Josie is there as well. But the point that Para makes about belief is important, because actually one of the other sort of very bleak parts of this book is that the only character in it who does believe in something higher than, you know, does desire to thinks about something transcendental almost, whether it be the sun's power or the sort of superstitious belief that the bringing an end to the Cootings machine would and pleasing the sun in that way, making a sacrifice for the sun, would save Josie, is Klara. I mean, there's a real kind of cold, rational, logical way in which lots of the other characters, you know, exist. I mean, the housekeeper, for example, even though she's quite a two-dimensional character in some ways, is the kind of epitome of that very perfunctory, very kind of detached in a way, kind of, even though she cares about Josie, the kind of what am I trying to look for? You know, just a dismissal of anything that isn't immediate, that isn't explainable. You know, the fact that you can imagine if Chrissy had caught Klara in the barn, how disdainful she would have been of that, in this kind of a way that I think he's trying to say something, that Klara perhaps is more human in some ways than the others, but her ability to desire that someone, whether it be God or the sun or something else, intervenes and saves her, that kind of longing is very human. But I just wanted to finish on pointing to this scene in which the really harrowing bit at the waterfall, where you get a kind of the first little glimpse that something's happening in relation to Chrissy's plans for this Josie robot, where she asks Klara to first start imitating her walk. And then you remember when she asked Klara to walk like Josie in the store, and then she gets Klara to talk like Josie, and has the most the thing that's so moving about it is she has the most, it's suggested that she has the most frank conversation with her daughter that she ever has, the most real conversation with her daughter that she ever has, because she says to Klara, pretending to be Josie, she gets angry with her and she says, you're not going to be fine, and I wish you would stop getting sick. And when Josie Klara says, I'm going to be fine, she says, how can you say that? What do you know about it? And don't make me promises. Sal made me promises. And she's, she is real. She's not being real with Josie in a way that you can understand, because she wants to protect her daughter. But she's being real in this interaction with a fake Josie. And then, 2 pages after that, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but 2 pages after that, on the very kind of, it all goes sour, as we know, because Josie starts saying, don't worry, I've got a special plan. And then Chrissy kind of snaps out of it and says, what's this? This isn't Josie, this is you. And it all goes sour in the car. And when she's looking out of the car, she sees these sheep that she compares with the bull that caused so much fear in her. And she's anthropomorphizing them in some ways. But then she sees Klara says this: I could see a tree with a trunk that was in fact 3 thin trunks entwined together to look like a single one. I observed it carefully as we passed, turning in my seat to see it for longer. And if we're to accept that Ishiguro does nothing by accident in his books, and that particularly in this book it is very, very pared back, and every word is placed, really, it's actually the craft of his of his writing is incredible. Then there must be something that he's hinting, alluding to us here, in that idea of the rooms within rooms of the heart, of the tree being actually 3 trees within one, and nodding to that complexity that Klara can kind of just about, or is reaching to understand. That's what she's saying at the end, that there's something within Rick and the mother and the manager and all these people that has Josie at heart that I will never have. It's that kind of what Ishiguro is constantly saying is this: can you understand the human soul? Can you understand the human heart? This thing that we don't have any factual proof of, a conscience, a living world within ourselves. And I don't know that he's saying yes or no, but he's saying it's complicated. And I guess what he's saying is that the acknowledging that it's complicated is part of the human experience, but it's also something that we might be losing touch of, that desire to investigate that complexity, to enter through those rooms in rooms. I mean, the reason why the Father Paul is so dispiriting is because he's given up on the rooms within rooms. He's kind of saying, yeah, well, I think probably I'm afraid that Capaldi is right. And the reason why the mother is in many ways so wonderful actually is because she can't, because she, at the end of the day, whether it's putting our faith in the sun or some kind of higher being, or whether it's trying to work out trying to stave off loneliness, that complexity of coming to terms with our rooms within rooms is integral to the human experience. And I think that's, whether it be the myth making of the buried giant or the fact of the love story and Never Let Me Go, it's that kind of Ishiguro, he says it's his dirty secret. He's returning again and again to trying to not answer the question of whether we have a heart and whether artificial intelligence can replicate that heart and soul, but actually what it is, you know, can we come face to face with the idea that we do have one and we might not ever actually understand it, and what does that mean for our sense of ourselves? I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Ella. That was really really interesting discussion, brilliant introduction. So I'll ask you all to unmute, and then round of applause, or virtual round of applause, or whatever. And then at the end we can stay for a chat if you like, but just a couple of announcements.